For 30 years, Johnny Carson welcomed more than 22,000 people onto The Tonight Show couch. Movie legends, politicians, comics, oddball inventors. Johnny met them all with that easy grin, quick timing, and genuine curiosity. But even the most unflappable hosts sometimes felt the room tilt. Friends and producers could spot it. A subtle lean back, a tighter smile, a change in rhythm. Johnny could handle combative guests or divas. What truly rattled him were people whose presence felt off. A longtime producer put it this way: Johnny never cracked on camera, but once in a while, he'd admit afterward, something about that person wasn't right. Not difficult, disturbing. Below are the 9 appearances that most unsettled television's steadiest ringmaster. Moments of manic energy, eerie stillness, slurred spirals, and chilly hostility that made Johnny uncomfortable on his own stage. Truman Capote, author of In Cold Blood and Breakfast at Tiffany's, was a sparkling talk show presence in the 1960s and early 1970s. Later, as addiction took hold, his visits became unnervingly spectral. A director recalled that Capote would speak in a wispy, half-audible voice, trail off mid-sentence, then resume as if time hadn't passed. Johnny said it felt like interviewing a ghost fading in and out of our dimension. During a 1975 appearance, Capote arrived visibly intoxicated, drifting through disjointed stories about death, celebrity secrets, and the paranormal. He stared into empty space, giggled at nothing, and whispered lines like, "You don't really believe that, do you, Johnny?" The audience didn't know whether to laugh or worry. The segment was cut short, a rarity. During break, Johnny reportedly muttered that Capote sounded like a haunted house, whispering its own memoir. Capote was quietly benched for a time. When he returned, years later, producers took precautions. Johnny, though cordial, stayed wary. German actor Klaus Kinski, famed for Vera Herzog's Ager, The Wrath of God, and Nosferatu the Vampire, brought an unnerving volatility. From the first step onto the stage in the late 1970s, he radiated a crackling, dangerous energy. Bulging eyes, clenched jaw, barely blinking. Johnny, who normally leaned toward guests, angled away, asked about his film. Kinski launched into an apocalyptic tirade about art, religion, and the end of everything. Light quips only drew hostile stars that made the audience gasp. Security was on alert. The control room debated ending the segment early. Ed McMahon later said Johnny felt like he was sitting next to a bomb. For years afterward, whenever a tense guest loomed, staff would comfort Carson. "At least it can't be worse than Kinski." Known from In Cold Blood and TV's Beretta, Robert Blake arrived radiating frost. From his first clipped answers and sarcastic counters, "Why would you ask me that?" the temperature dropped. Humor fell flat. Blake fixed Johnny with a long, unblinking stare, speaking in an eerily calm voice that didn't match the simmering anger underneath. Carson stayed professional, but withdrew. More glances at his note cards, more physical distance. "I felt studied," he told a producer later. Not disliked, observed. Like a specimen, Blake was not invited back on Johnny's watch. Years later, when Blake's legal troubles exploded, Carson reportedly told a colleague he wasn't surprised. He had sensed something deeply unsettling that night. Johnny enjoyed Andy Kaufman as Andy, but when Kaufman arrived as his confrontational alter ego, Tony Clifton, chaos replaced conversation. Clifton slouched out in a cheap tux, bad wig, giant glasses, and a fog of cologne, and immediately broke every Tonight Show norm. Interrupting Johnny, insulting Ed McMahon, leering at staff, ignoring all cues. The act crescendoed when Clifton, furious at the band's backup for his intentionally awful singing, flung a glass of water toward musical director Doc Seinson. Johnny did something almost unheard of. He walked off his own set, leaving Ed to mop up. Security eventually hauled Clifton out during the break, still screaming. Carson later said the creepiness wasn't the rudeness, it was the absolute refusal to acknowledge reality. Kaufman himself remained welcome, but Johnny personally banned Tony Clifton from ever returning. Vaudeville veteran and producer George Jessel, then in his 70s, represented another era, and not in a charming way. Early 1970s, Tonight Show bookers hoped for warm reminiscences. Instead, Jessel launched into an appallingly dated monologue stuffed with slurs and stereotypes that might have landed in the 1920s, but stunned the 1970s audience into horrified silence. Johnny froze in a pained smile, weighing options: confront an elderly guest on live TV, laugh and appear complicit, or kill the segment. He opted to cut to commercial early. When the show returned, Jessel was gone. Backstage, Johnny was livid. "That is not what this show is about." Jessel was never invited again, and the staff tightened Prian, especially for old guard entertainers. What rattled Johnny most wasn't only the material, it was Jessel's obliviousness, as though time had stopped for him decades earlier. Before drag was mainstream, Divine, star of John Waters films like Pink Flamingos and Female Trouble, arrived in the mid-1970s with towering beehive, blazing makeup, and a deliberately provocative presence. Divine was professional and prepared, but the cultural clash was real. Johnny, a Midwestern traditionalist at heart, struggled to find the tone. Serious artist, camp provocateur, novelty act. He kept a slightly wider berth than usual, laughed a bit too tightly, and ping-ponged between curiosity and discomfort. The audience, unsure how to respond, alternated between nervous chuckles and silence. Standards and practices hovered over the dump button. Johnny stayed respectful. He always did, but exhaled with visible relief when the segment ended. Later, he quipped gently, "That was certainly something different for the folks in Omaha tonight." It became a small watershed for the show, a signal that Carson would platform challenging voices even when they spooked him. Unlike most on this list, Vincent Price was both beloved and unsettling by design. He could be charmingly erudite discussing cooking or art collecting, then drop his voice into that silken menace and watch the goosebumps rise. Johnny's included. In one memorable bit, the lights dimmed and Price read, "Posed the Raven by candlelight." As the recital deepened, Johnny's smile thinned and his shoulders crept up. Afterward, he joked that it felt like Price had actually summoned something. Price delighted in the dance, bringing prop spiders a taxidermy bat, which Johnny held with fascinated discomfort and the occasional wrist grab punctuated by a chilling whisper. Carson adored him, but you could see the instinctive flinch. As Johnny once said, Vincent is the only guest who can terrify you and make you hope he comes back soon. In the late 1970s, Margot Hemingway, the face of Faber's Babe and granddaughter of Ernest Hemingway, was a glamorous welcome guest. By the early 1980s, things had changed. She appeared disoriented with glassy eyes and erratic speech. She'd begin a thought, drift off into a long stare, then rejoin the conversation midstream as if no gap had occurred. At other moments, she answered questions Johnny hadn't asked. Carson didn't get impatient. He grew concerned. He shortened his replies to minimize strain and tried gentle, concrete questions to steady her. The audience sensed the crisis and went quiet. Backstage, when someone cracked a joke, Johnny cut it off. That wasn't difficult. That was someone in trouble. In hindsight, given her later public battles with addiction and bipolar disorder and her tragic death by suicide in 1996, the segment reads like a televised warning flare. Johnny seemed to feel that in the moment, and it shook him. Andy Warhol turned his early 1980s visit into an accidental masterpiece of discomfort. It wasn't hostility, intoxication, or antics. It was the void. Warhol offered one-word answers, long, unblinking stars, and the faintest enigmatic smiles. Jokes landed like pebbles in a well. Johnny tried everything in his toolkit. Open-ended prompts, specific questions about technique, personal anecdotes, even addressing the awkwardness directly. Nothing pierced the bubble. At one point, he asked, "Do you even want to be here?" Warhol shrugged. A producer later said it felt less like an interview than performance art, an existential vacuum that bent time and defied rapport. Johnny joked afterwards that Warhol might have been made of wax, but he was genuinely rattled. "Either that was the worst interview I've ever done or a brilliant piece of performance art, and I'm not sure which bothers me."